Our final two presenters will tell us why data is your secret weapon in uncertain times. They are Sean Byrnes, CEO and co-founder of Outlier, and Andrea Spillmann-Gajek, VP of Customer Success with Outlier. Sean, the podium is yours.
Excellent. Thanks, John. We're excited to be here today to talk about data in uncertain times, and I think obviously the sessions today have highlighted the market is different today than it was 6 months ago. Business is changing. You don't need us to tell you that. What we can do, however, is help you understand how you can get a foothold in the current market using data. Obviously, the market's not going to go back to the way it was. That doesn't mean you can't return to growth. It doesn't mean you can't be in a recovery mode. It doesn't mean that you can't start to go back to a more growth mindset of your business, and data can be the way to get there, and that's what we'll go through today. So our goal is to give you a series of practical advice, practical tips, real actionable things you can do, along with real examples of companies just like yours that are doing these things today. So coming out of this session, our hope is you have a toolkit that you can start using tomorrow to get your company using data to start the recovery. My name is Sean Byrnes. I'm the CEO and founder of Outlier. I've spent 20 years of my career in the data space helping companies use data to make better decisions, which is of course now more relevant than ever. I'm joined by Andrea, whom I'll let introduce herself.
Great to meet you all. I'm Andrea Spillmann-Gajek, VP of Customer Success. So I have the pleasure of working directly with our customers here at Outlier to understand how they are using data to drive their businesses forward and especially navigate and find the opportunity within these challenging times.
And we're excited to be here today. So why is it that data is such a high priority for us? Why is it top of mind, especially in terms of working in a crisis? So our company, Outlier, is part of a new class of software called automated business analysis. And automated business analysis is very different than what you might think of in terms of business intelligence or data. These kinds of tools use artificial intelligence to analyze your data sets across what could be dozens of systems. Maybe you use Adobe's cloud, maybe you use Salesforce's cloud, maybe you have databases, maybe you have many databases. These new kind of tools are designed to connect to those data sources in minutes, and without requiring you to set them up and configure them, their job is to look through that data using artificial intelligence and bring you the unexpected insights that are hiding there, the questions that are hiding below the surface of the data. Now, obviously, this is a key and valuable capability in today's market when there are so many unknowns and there's so many things that are changing that don't fit your historical intuitive pattern of the business. So we'll go through this. We obviously, because of our value, we're working in the front lines with dozens of Fortune 500 CPG businesses to help with their response to the crisis, help in their planning for the future, and we're bringing those lessons here to you. You don't have to use Outlier to follow the lessons we're going to go through today. Obviously, we'd love it if you did, but if you have your own analyst team, if you have your own business intelligence tools, those are going to work as well. So this is where we're coming from. Our experience is real. In the last 6 months, we've been in the trenches, and so everything we're going to share with you are real examples of real things that do work in today's market. And what we're going to cover are 4 areas, 4 specific actionable areas of advice around data and how it can contribute to your recovery. And so for each of the 4, we'll go through the theory of what you do, how you would do it, and then we'll go through specific companies and how they're doing it and the impact they can have. So kind of tie it all together for you. And before I jump in there, let's quickly talk about what doesn't work in terms of data, because I think the world's different. There's a few things that's really important to think about when what doesn't work. The first is all of the dashboards, all the KPIs that you created in the previous market more than 6 months ago, they're not going to work anymore. Now, it's not the case that all those KPIs are incorrect. Obviously, you care about your revenue and those sorts of numbers. But it's built on a model of the business that might not be true anymore. You know, buying behavior has moved online. Buyers are buying for different reasons now. So if you think about that dashboard that you have, it's really a formulation of how you think the business should work and how the market should work. And the reality is those things are different now. The market works differently. Competition is different. Consumer behavior is different. And so we can't just sit back and expect that the same dashboard, the same KPIs that we chose are going to be able to guide us through this next stage of our business evolution. The other thing that doesn't work is our intuition. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years, and my intuition is based on 20 years of experience. Unfortunately, that experience is in a market that works very fundamentally different than the market works today. And so trusting our gut instincts, trusting our intuition is dangerous because it can betray us. Really what we need is a fresh look at the business, a fresh look at the market, and a new framework for understanding where we are And that's really what data is going to give us. And that's what these 4 topics we go through are designed to get us to. So let's get started with the first one. And this is talking about finding a baseline for our business. What can we trust? If you believe what I said, which I can tell you is true across the customers we work with, if you can't just rely on the same dashboard, the same KPIs you've always used, well, where do you start? Where is that baseline that you can use to build up from? Because having a baseline, having that foundation is really important to grow for the future. And so let's talk about data. So what you see here is a metric. It could be almost any metric in your business. It looks like most of the metrics out there. It was pretty consistent for a while. It was growing. And you can see there on the right, it kind of, not only did it decrease, it became very noisy all of a sudden. And that was in March when the pandemic first resulted in shelter in place, work from home, these sorts of changes in our society. Now, the third thing to notice here, and this goes back to why we can't trust data necessarily, is that not only did the metric drop, it became very sporadic. It's jumping up one day, down the next day. It gets very hard to zoom out and gather any general trend from the data that you see there. And that becomes the challenge. That becomes why a baseline is so important. So if you think about it, this yellow area over there, this is the pandemic. It's up, it's down, it's getting less predictable, and we really need a baseline to build from. And so our goal here is to identify what is still working, what in the business is still true. So of my dashboard, I may have a few dozen metrics in my dashboards. Which of those dozen metrics are still representative of the way the market works today? Of my customer segments, all of my customers as a general body aren't going to behave the same, but some of my customer segments might be. So which of my customer segments are still behaving the same way they used to? Which customer segments are still buying? So how do we figure that out? Well, the first thing we need to do is redefine performance, right? So maybe previous to the pandemic, our performance was based on revenue. We're very focused on top-line growth. The reality is today that might not actually be the best way to think about performance. The best performance may be in conversion rates and return rates, those sorts of things that are indicating that certain customer segments are still buying at the same rate they were, or certain products are still being moved in the way that they were before. That kind of change is something you can look for under the surface to find those customer segments that really are still buying, that are behaving as you would expect. Because at the top line, the problem is, as if all your customers aren't behaving the same, overall revenue is probably not a most reliable metric. So as we redefine performance, we look for the things that we think are going to indicate, okay, this is the same as it's always been. This is something we know and understand and can build from. And that means that we're going to have to audit our fundamentals. We're going to have to go through systematically those dashboards, those KPIs, and say, okay, which of these can I trust now? Which of these are probably representative of the market? Which of these will show me these kinds of islands of continuity that I can build from? And it takes a lot of work to go through them, I admit, but it is better than using a dashboard that's going to mislead you and lead you to some false conclusions. And finally, it's really important to talk to your customers. And that's because even if there are customer segments that are buying in the same way they used to buy, and even if some of your metrics are still predictable, the reasons that customers buy may be different. So, over 6 months ago, if somebody was buying a lot of candles at home, it likely was because, for example, they wanted to work on their home ambiance. They actually cared a lot about the aromas in their house. Today, if people are buying candles, they actually might be a lot more worried about power outages. And so they might be buying the same amount of product. They might be actually purchasing it in the same way, but the reasons behind it are different. And understanding those reasons is very, very important in order to help you make better decisions and also identify these fundamentals. Now, I know this can sound a little bit high level. Let me hand this over to Andrea so she can walk us through how real customers are doing exactly what I've described here in their business today.
Great. Thanks, Sean. I think that setup was perfect to describe what we're seeing here and how one of our e-commerce clients has in fact done just that, really. And so this insight came to them over the weekend. And so what they were seeing in Outlier and what they were seeing in their business in general was that the average transaction amount for this particular customer segment had been somewhere around $30 to $40. So they had a group of customers not contributing a lot to their overall revenue, contributing around 8% to overall revenue. But suddenly that customer segment almost doubled or more than doubled their average transaction amount. Something was really working within this customer segment. What we heard from the clients is that once they saw this insight, and not only did that spike up on Friday, on Saturday, and later in the week, it seemed to really hold steady. By the weekend, they had seen that this seemed to be more of a new normal, less of a one-off trend, less of a one-off spike, and more of something that was consistent within this customer segment. So our client has been able to dig into, what exactly was going on. Why did this customer segment spike up and stay up? What exactly was driving their success? And they had some hypotheses, and to your point, Sean, they weren't sure if those hypotheses were correct, so they actually went and talked to this customer segment. They dug into some other data. They tried to understand how they could leverage the success in this smaller group to really extend that across their customers, or to figure out how they could dive deeper in to perhaps leverage this particular really successful group of customer even more. And what they told us was really interesting about this was because it's a smaller segment of their customers, because it only impacts about 8% of their revenue, they mentioned that they'd seen an uptick in overall revenue, but it was small. And they weren't sure, they didn't really hone in on that until they saw really at this segmented level what was going on and where it was most significant. And so they've been able to use this now. They've discussed with us a few changes they've already been making this week to hopefully leverage kind of this indicator of where something's working and this leading sign of a change to really improve their business.
Thanks, Andrea. That was great. And I agree with you, and I think it's an important point that the examples we're using here are from Outlier. It doesn't mean you have to use Outlier to use these techniques. Your internal analyst team, your internal BI tools might be able to provide this. We just obviously have a wealth of examples from just even the past few weeks about how these techniques are being used. That was a great example of one of them. So let's move on to a second example. So let's talk about finding opportunities. So every crisis environment you might be in, every market that's in flux, it can bring negatives. It can bring doors that are closed, but it can also open up new doors and create new opportunities. Change is a great environment where things that are maybe possible now that weren't possible before. And so identifying those new opportunities can be a competitive advantage. How do we do that? Well, let's think about it this way. So if these are a few metrics, it looks like a little bit like that metric we saw in the first topic we talked about. They've been pretty consistent for a while, then all of a sudden in March they started to get much noisier, much less predictable. What we really want to do is now, if I want to identify what new opportunities exist in the market, what new doors have opened that didn't open before, what we're looking for is not metrics like those. We're looking for the inverse. What behaves differently? What started to grow when everything else was contracting? And so maybe what we're looking for is something that looks a bit like this green metric here. So you can notice it was very small. It was a very small part of your customer base or your revenue or whatever this might be for a while. But the minute everything else started going down, it started going up. And it might be noisy. It might go up and down, as you can see there. But the key thing is that it's actually contrarian. It's going up when things are going down. That is a very strong indicator that there's something there that didn't used to be there. There's something there that didn't used to exist. So maybe these are customer segments. And as Andrea said, one of those customer segments all of a sudden is buying more, even though a lot of customer segments are buying less. Or these could be product lines, where one product line is all of a sudden selling better than the others. These are very strong indicators that something has changed in the market, that there's new buying behaviors from consumers, there's new markets being opened, new channels being unlocked, all sorts of new opportunities that may not have existed previously. And the great news is if you can find these before the competition, if you can identify these before everybody else does, you can invest ahead of them. You can take advantage of them. We've seen numerous examples, and Andrea will walk you through a few in a second, about how companies have seen these kind of greenfield new opportunities pop up. And if they act quickly, it's a great way to get a revenue growth driver in place, even when the market is challenged and even the market itself is not growing. So let's talk about how do we find them. So it's great to know that they're there, but obviously finding them is the entire point of this. How do we do that? So the first thing to do is you realize you have to do a comprehensive survey of your data. I know that sounds intimidating. I know we have a lot of data. Trust me, I've worked in the industry for a long time. But really the reality is these things are not going to exist in places that you typically are used to looking. They're not going to exist in your dashboards or your KPIs because, again, they're by definition different than the model of the business that you thought existed, or at least it existed before the crisis hit. And so in this case, you're going to have to look in places that you wouldn't normally look. For example, you can, maybe you're used to looking in terms of marketing research at consumer buying behavior, at consumer conversion rates and revenue and loyalty programs. What about customer support requests, right? What about logistics issues? There's all sorts of other areas that might indicate and give you an idea of where to look for these new opportunities. And so you have to put aside that intuitive model you have of the business and be very open-minded about looking. And what you're looking for when you're out there is you're looking for these outliers. You're looking for these things that don't fit, that are now behaving differently than everything else. What is that product line that all of a sudden is selling to this customer segment at a higher rate than they were before, while all the products might be down? Or where is that customer segment that's really investing more and buying more frequently? It's really key to find them. And again, you have to keep an open mind. I've said that before, but the reality is it's very hard to put aside all the things that we know, all the experience we've gained. But if we don't, then we're not going to find these things that are surprising. And the reality is they may not always make sense. It might not be clear immediately when you see, say, one of these new outliers, these new opportunities, why is it that this customer segment is buying this product more frequently? The why may not be obvious. But keeping an open mind means that you can look at these things and say, this is an interesting question. Let's start to dig in and see what's there. And in doing so, again, what you're building is not just a growth engine. It can be a competitive advantage. If you build a culture at your company and a capability to identify these things quickly before the competition is understanding what's going on, you can immediately invest and get ahead of them in ways that other companies can. And we have lots of great examples of that. And in fact, Andrea will share one of those with you right now.
Yeah, I think, Sean, what you're saying is exactly what we've been hearing from our customers. In fact, we were meeting with an executive in retail in about late May, early June, and he was telling us, look, we know the platform is changing in retail. The market is changing. Whoever can adjust to that most quickly is going to win. This is a huge opportunity. We just have to know what's going on first to be able to take advantage of that. And so here's an example of one way that a CPG client actually was able to take advantage of some shifts in the market within their own consumer base. This example also comes from over the weekend. And what they saw were that two products in particular that hadn't even been in the top 100 in terms of popularity for them suddenly were both in the top 10. And by digging into this and what was driving this, they were able to find out one of those products had been newly launched. And so they were hoping that would gain in popularity, but they weren't expecting it to jump up nearly that quickly. And then the other had been a little bit more of a laggard that they were excited to see popping up. These actually were leading indicators of other groups of products that they think can also become more popular for their customers and hopefully push their revenue ahead. And so by understanding this insight, what they were able to do is not just understand how to adjust their marketing and how to adjust really their product and their product preparation, but also to make sure that the supply chain is in place. We are hearing from our clients that while things are getting more and more back to normal, supply chain is still a concern, manufacturing is still a concern. And so they're able to, by seeing these leading indicators, make sure that they're able to really dig in and take advantage of what their customers and their consumers want and be ready to meet that demand.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. And I'll reiterate that the examples we're using are of the recent past. These are literally case studies from the past week, so they are very relevant for you. And I think the key aspect there is these things can happen quickly. You know, that was an insight that change, that shift happened day over day. That's the kind of speed at which these changes can happen for you. And this is why it's so important to get ahead of them and start looking today. Great, let's keep moving. We're talking about our third topic now, early indicators. So obviously what we've talked about so far is how to get your feet under you, how to find growth opportunities in the market when it's in flux. But we all are looking forward to recovery. Some markets have started to recover already. Some markets are really in the very early stages of what might be a recovery, and some have a ways to go. But regardless of where that is, markets are not going to recover uniformly at the same time. Certain customer segments, certain kinds of product categories, certain kinds of channels will recover in different ways at different rates. And understanding when those different aspects are recovering and knowing when that's happening so you can invest ahead of it, this is a really important point of your strategy, because if you do this well and you invest at the right times, it's like surfing. If you catch the wave at the right time, it's great, but if you miss the wave, it doesn't matter how fast you paddle, you're never going to catch up. So let's talk about that. What do we mean by early indicator? What I'm showing you here is a metric that indicates some kind of recovery. So you see that the metric had been gliding down for a while and all of a sudden jumped up really quickly. And often in these markets where a crisis has shocked the system, the recovery does happen fairly quickly. There's a lot of pent-up consumer demand. There's a lot of pent-up buying power. And these kind of things really do explode in many cases out of the gate. This might be a slightly exaggerated example to make my point, but you get the idea. And so our key here is to figure out, okay, as part of this, how do we understand when we can expect that jump? Because again, the data is very noisy. We've talked about this a few times. In a dynamic market like we're in, your data is going to be up, it's going to be down. There's going to be a lot of mirages. There's a lot of things that may look like maybe it's a recovery, maybe it's not, but we really want to make sure we lean into things that really are. And so how do we figure out that this is going to be a real recovery, a real jump, and not just a little blip on the radar? What we want to find are these early indicators, something like the purple metric. When the purple metric goes up, it actually indicates that there's very likely to be a jump in our recovery metric in the future. So the recovery metric might be revenue for a specific customer segment. So what is that purple metric? How do we figure out what it is so we can be prepared for when that jump happens, so we can know ahead of time? Well, what we'll walk you through here is a little way to think about it. The first is we want to create what we call a growth threshold. So a growth threshold is a way to think about how to tell the difference between a mirage in the data, a mirage recovery, and a real recovery, something that really is growing. And so where that red arrow is there on the chart, that's pretty low, right? If the metric had jumped that high, it really isn't clear it's going to turn into anything at that point. Because you can see previously there was plenty of jumps both up and down across the metrics. At the second arrow, though, at the top, that's by the time that happens, it's too late, right? This kind of explosion in recovery has already happened. If you wait until that point to recover, to act, it's probably you've missed the boat. The wave has already passed. You can't catch it to surf on it. And so really what we want to do is we want to find what we believe is somewhere in between. Something that says, okay, this is clearly a recovery. This isn't just a mirage, and it hasn't already happened. It's somewhere in between. But if we hit this point, we're pretty sure it will continue. We're pretty sure this is a real recovery, real things are happening. And what we want to do then is take a step backwards and say, okay, what could have indicated, and with enough time for you to act on it, that growth threshold was going to be hit? What would have told me that we're very likely to get there? And again, these metrics could be whatever you think about in terms of recovery. It could be revenue, it could be total products sold, etc. And so how do we actually do that? And in doing that, we're working backwards. And again, we're going to think broadly. So when I say think broadly, what I mean is that these early indicators very likely are not things that are super intuitive. Going back to my example, it might be obvious that when people actually buy things, that's an indicator that they're buying again. But again, that might be too late. So maybe you look at metrics like people doing research on your website, investigating products, looking at product details, or even in some cases calling customer support, asking questions about the product, doing research, because those consumers know that they're likely to start buying again soon. And so you want to look for those kind of early indicators of them doing product research to decide, okay, there's very likely to be a surge in demand soon, and that surge in demand will probably hit our threshold, which means we're going to see a recovery at least within this customer segment, at least within this geography, at least within this kind of product group, whatever that might be. And we're really going to have to broaden our minds, because in the case of early indicators, it's like throwing a net. You want to throw enough of a net to make sure that if there is a recovery, you're going to catch it, or at least some of your early indicators will go off. But if we have just one early indicator, that's not going to be enough. So you're probably in the end going to have a dozen, maybe 2 dozen early indicators, things that you're watching that if they do start to tick up, will indicate that a recovery is very likely to follow. And again, not all 2 dozen early indicators will go off at the same time. But what you're doing is throwing out 1 dozen, 2 dozen early indicators so that when 1 or 2 or 3 of them do start to tick up, they give you a sense of where that recovery is happening. And so that's a really important way to think about this. It's essentially not like replacing your KPIs. These early indicators are not your KPIs. They're not your main metrics from your business. They are a second set of metrics you're looking at that will give you a hint that something's coming. And that something coming is going to impact that KPI and bring you that recovery. And so again, you have to think pretty broadly and be creative, because currently in the market, those early indicators are probably different than early indicators you might have chosen a year ago. So that flexibility in thinking, that flexibility in approach is a really important part of choosing these successfully. But You don't take my word for it. I'll hand it over to Andrea to talk about a real customer and exactly how they do just this.
So this example comes from another e-commerce customer, and this is one of our slightly older examples because I wanted to give you the full view from here to today. So this indicator, this was an early indicator for them from early June. And we were copied in on some of the comments that they had back and forth on this. They were really excited to see a couple of very specific trends. And the first thing that they saw, you can see in these two stories, for a particular page path for account rewards, new users had been trending down since pretty much the start of COVID. They care about this account rewards page because rewards are a really important motivator, particularly within one of their key client groups. They're tracking how is this page doing. They saw, again, new users had been trending down. At the same time that new users is trending down, exit rate started getting a little bit noisy, which you might expect with fewer users, but really going up a bit too. So they were getting fewer users. The users they were getting were less engaged since COVID. But in early June, that changed. They started seeing an uptick and a sustained upward trend in new users. And they saw a record low for the exits on that page. So not only were they getting more users, but they were getting a very, very engaged group of users on there. The comments that this marketing team had that they were copying us on were excited that they were seeing these, as they put them, almost pre-COVID numbers. And so they were able to really dig in. They were able to understand what motivators are driving this group, what is the success of this group. And while on June 5th, when they were seeing these early indicators, revenue hadn't yet ticked up, they were able to take advantage of this early learning to lean in more heavily, and did in fact see that following the upticked engagement from these users, revenue did start to trend up shortly after this. And they did see a recovery, at least a partial recovery, within this group of particularly engaged users. And so we've been happy to be able to follow that over time and see that by digging into, exactly to Sean's point, not necessarily the high level metric or not necessarily the lagging indicator that you'd expect, but these leading indicators that show the particular segments, the particular engagement paths, and really these multiple metrics that can together tell a more complete story, that they were able to understand what was happening and take action really quickly to both prepare for the uptick, but also to help guide that and dig into it and motivate it.
Great example, absolutely. So let's talk about our fourth and final topic here, planning ahead. Obviously, we're all in the business of planning. That's how you implement your corporate strategy. What does planning look like? How does data help us here? Well, the first thing is, before the crisis happened, before the pandemic, I'm sure you are on an annual planning. You might have been on a 2-year planning or even a 5-year planning horizon. Whatever it was, you were planning far in advance. That's how we get ahead of the market. That's how we create strategies. That's how we manage. And when that crisis first hit in March, you probably moved, like most companies, to a crisis management or an initial crisis handling phase where you're really planning a week in advance. And at that point, that week is really a plan to come up with a plan. You realize that the old plan doesn't work. What's our new operating plan? How do we react? And then you slowly moved into a crisis management phase where you're looking a month ahead. We didn't know what to expect. We didn't know what was going to happen. You have to be very reactive, very flexible. And eventually the market starts to stabilize, and many of us find ourselves in markets today where companies have returned to quarterly planning. They do quarterly budgeting. They look about a quarter in advance. And hopefully eventually we plan to get back to the recovery that we expect and start to plan a year in advance, 2 years in advance again. Now the key thing I bring in here is it's really important that your planning horizon matches the foresight you have into the business. There's a very strong danger, because we're so used to doing long-term planning, that you try to use that muscle that you're familiar with. You try to go back to annual planning too quickly, just because you're used to doing it. And if the metrics, if the data you see doesn't give you confidence that you know what the market will be like in 6 months, in 9 months, in a year, then doing that planning is really dangerous, because it'll just guarantees you'll do repeated replanning. You'll have to constantly replan. So choosing the planning horizon is really important. And it's also important to mention that It's not the case that you'll always be able to absorb the impact of a crisis and slowly extend your planning horizon. It's very likely in some cases you can get to a point where the market stabilizes, you're planning quarterly, and another jolt to the system, another fundamental change comes in, and you have to revert to a crisis management mode again. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. What actually the bigger danger is trying to revert to a longer-term planning too quickly, because it may actually mislead you in believing that you believe where the market will be in a way that might not be reliable. So let the data guide you in terms of how far in advance you can predict. The way to do that is to make a prediction. So at the start of the quarter, obviously you have predictions about where you think the market will be at the end of the quarter. Check back at the end of the quarter. Are those predictions you made, did they come true? How accurate were you? If it turns out that for, say, 2 quarters in a row, you're able to accurately predict where the market is, that probably is a good indication that you can extend your planning horizon. But if it turns out you try to predict the market and you're way off because the market's so crazy, it's a very dangerous time to start to extend your planning horizon too quickly. Cool, we've covered a lot. Obviously, we don't want to spend all day on this, but hopefully we've walked away with 4 concrete examples of things you can do. Let's talk about them quickly. The first is that your recovery dealing with this crisis starts with the fundamentals, and those fundamentals are not the top-level metrics. They're going to be the customer segments, the product lines, the geographies, the things that are still behaving the way that you're familiar with them behaving, the same way that they used to behave. Those become your building blocks upon which to build your strategies. We talked about some real examples from customers about how that becomes where they start in rebuilding their strategy for the future. The second is, obviously, every crisis closes doors, but it also opens new ones. And having a really clear eye and a very careful examination to find those new opportunities is an enormous competitive advantage if you can find them quickly, especially if you find them before your competitors. And again, those things will live in unintuitive places. They'll live in places that you wouldn't have thought to look before these things changed, before the market shifted. And that's okay. It is time-consuming to find them, but they are worth so much in terms of both revenue and strategic positioning if you do find them. And it's worth going to look for them because we know that they're out there. It's not a question of are they there, the question is where are they hiding. Third, whoever is able to find those early indicators of recovery is going to win because they can start to prepare for the recovery, invest ahead of the recovery before everybody else. Andrea gave that great example of people of the company looking at their account rewards users as an indicator of future revenue growth. That gave them the ability to invest ahead of it, to work on new promotions, new techniques, new tactics that they knew were going to arrive at just the right time ahead of a growth in revenue, which is exactly what happened. So if you can find those early indicators, and again, you'll have a lot of them, possibly a dozen, possibly 2 dozen, and they aren't your KPIs. These are metrics you're tracking that if they change, if they tick in those waves, they're probably very likely to indicate future growth. You're going to have an advantage. You're going to be able to invest quickly and be more agile. And finally, be careful of planning too far in advance. You want to plan as far ahead as you can see, and the accuracy of your predictions in terms of the metrics that you track is a really good indicator of how far in advance you should be planning. I strongly recommend not trying to plan 3 or 4 years in advance right now. It's very unclear how the systemic changes in our businesses and our markets are going to play out. But the planning horizon you use is going to be based on your confidence in your metrics and your business. So make sure that you're planning on a horizon that makes a lot of sense for you. And that's what we had to cover. I hope you came away with a lot of examples and practical things that you can use at your company. We have a lot more resources on our website, including more examples of real companies and how they're dealing with it. A lot of just content about doing these kind of techniques, how you can implement them, whether or not you want to use a tool like Outlier or not. We're here to help. I think that we see our job as helping people make better decisions with data, and we're here to help you do that. With that being said, we're open to questions. If anybody has any questions on what we covered or other things that we didn't cover.
Yes, Sean, there are a couple of questions that came in during the presentation. The first one, in the new normal, what has surprised your clients with what they found in their data?
I'm happy to take that.
I'll hand over to Andrea.
Yeah, I think one of the things that surprised our customers the most is simply that what they thought they knew, it doesn't hold true anymore. So Sean mentioned a little bit at the beginning as well that we as leaders have built up an intuition that we could pretty much trust over time. But again, that intuition has been built in settings and environments and markets very different from what we have now. I mean, we've also built up, or at least I know many of our clients have built up these kind of go-to questions. When something's happening, we have the first top 5 things we want to go look at, or we want to check into, or we want to know what's happening. And they found that often those aren't the right ones anymore. What's happening, what's underneath, is changing in ways they didn't even expect. The questions they thought to ask aren't necessarily leading to the answers they need. And the questions they never thought to ask start to become the most important ones. The leading indicators start to be things they didn't even know to go look for. And that's what we're hearing has been kind of the most surprising, is just how everything they thought they knew is really upended in this world.
Okay, great. Next question. How do you support use cases around the supply chain, especially regarding demand forecasting and inventory?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one as well. So we have a number of use cases in the supply chain and really across the supply chain. One of the things that Outlier is able to do that our clients have found very helpful is to combine data from across multiple sources. So we can combine, let's say, everything from some of the leading indicators I showed of customer interest, but also things like support tickets, as well as warehouse operations, manufacturing operations. Many of our clients use a source like SAP HANA, but wherever that data lives, we can bring data from across multiple sources to help give the full picture of what's happening, what's going on, down to a detailed level of what process is taking the longest, up to the higher level of what are we seeing across the business and how can that impact things that the customer might need to know within manufacturing or warehouse operations or supply chain.
Okay, and our final question is a practical question. How much data can you analyze per client?
Yeah, that's a great question, and really the more data, the better in many cases for Outlier. And we really were created with the idea that, often customers have more data than they can ever possibly analyze by hand. There are many high volume areas, particularly in consumer business, and we are able to connect directly to clients' data wherever it lives. We're able to connect within 15 minutes, and really by the next day have insights generated from across that data. Many of our clients have millions of time series as we break down their metrics by every dimension, and hundreds of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of rows of data, if not more, per day.
Yeah. This is Sean. If I could add one more thing, I think it's important to note, we talked a few times about how the intuitive model doesn't fit anymore. I think that's also true of the data, that there's data sets that we're used to looking at in the same way that there's assumptions we have about the business that we're used to using. The reality is, as that model is changing, as that intuition is failing us, it's not clear that the same data sources that we're used to looking at are really the same ones to look at in the future. And this goes back to everything we've talked about so far, early indicators, growth opportunities, these sorts of things, is that you really do need to be comprehensive in your data strategy. You do need to look at the entirety of the business, not just the kind of places that were easy to look at or that you thought you needed to look at before. That was kind of the large undercurrent of what we had. And whether or not you use a tool like Outlier, or you have your analyst team surveying it, or you work with someone else, whatever you do, the key thing to take away from all of this is that you need to be really comprehensive in where you look across all of your data, because that's where these opportunities are hiding. And the market is speaking to us. The market is telling us how it operates today. The market's telling us how our expectations should change. We just have to find a way to listen. And that listening involves looking everywhere and being very open-minded about it.
Okay, well, thank you both. That was really excellent. Great topic, well presented. Thank you very much. And to reach out and follow up with Sean and Andrea, we'll put up their contact information on the screen in one moment. There's Sean and Andrea's email. You can reach out to both of them for follow-up information. Thank you both again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.